And so today we're going to talk about that not because we're just beating up on Google, because we do beat up on Google a lot, but it's largely because Google's getting its comeuppance for
Hmm.
25 years of misbehavior. Am I being fair? Am I being harsh? Too tough?
It's been a long time coming, and it's as we said before, it's happening all over the world.
It
Very similar
is.
kind of themes, just slightly different. In this particular case, as you said, just very testy legal language. It's great to read.
Yeah, from lawyers.
Yeah,
Yeah. So, if you've managed to tweak lawyers, that's a
yeah.
real challenge. So I'm going to start this off by setting the scene as to what I really enjoy about a really nice mic drop. When you
Mm,
just do a really good mic drop. So when I was working for a tabloid paper in the UK, we were doing a story about a well-known politician that had been naughtily taking some money out of the till of a charity and using it to renovate his office. And when we rang him to ask him about his response to this, he gave us this really, really long and florid kind of
mm,
answer that went on for about 20 minutes. It's like a filibuster. It was going on forever and ever and ever. And then when he eventually stopped to take breath, the editor who was sat next to me just said,
mm.
I wonder if we can move to a new topic. I don't know, like the truth. It was good. And I kind of got that same sense of moment when I read this. So I'm just going to set the scene. It's like literally, it's just a few words.
Mm,
So you've got all of these lawyers beavering away in the Canadian Competition Commission, trying to create a case to say that one of the world's most famous and amazing and innovative and richest and
mm,
powerful companies, okay, is utterly and completely anti-competitive and has been behaving abominably for years. So they put all this work in and they write this very great document. And then that goes off to Google's 97 million
mm,
lawyers, okay, and they all start beavering away on their typewriters and probably write an unbelievably devastating riposte that you're just like, goodness me, that's going to be a
mm.
disaster. And then this lands in my inbox and it says, Google's product market definition, this is their response, suffers from at least two flaws, both independently fatal. It's like,
Yeah,
thanks a lot for all your work. No. Yeah, yeah. If you got one of those on your
Mm,
desk, like reaction is what?
yeah. And when you find back, people say, "So how did it go? Have you read it yet? What have you read it? How did we do?" You're like, "Yeah, not great."
Yeah, that's bullet point number 4 on its
Yeah.
list. And what I love then is that they then go after something that was really irritated me for years and years and years about the way
Mm,
that Google does business, is that Google loves nothing more than a gray area. Like a grey area is seen by everybody else as something that's like, oh, that's a bit of a pain, right? For them, it's just an opportunity, right? And so all the way through their response, they refer to, the market isn't quite like that, and the ads don't really quite look like that, and this
yeah.
bit's not really like you're describing it. And they just go through the Canadian Competition Commission just goes, Google describes the market in vague terms. You're like,
Mm,
no surprise. And then it just says, but it's clear. Let's be clear. It is clear that Google has substantial market power, right? Given its high and sustained market share, barriers to entry and expansion, and its ability to degrade the quality of its product offerings with no material price impact or loss of revenue. Now, what I really love about that is that as a journalist, everyone always says, don't look at this, look at this.
mm, mm.
Or, I know you think you're looking at this, but actually it looks a bit like this. Yeah. It's always subterfuge and jazz hands, right? And like Google are Olympic champions at jazz hands. But
Mm.
eventually people have just had enough. And the DOJ landed them on a bullseye. And these guys have done exactly the same thing. I hear what you're saying. And I know your market's complicated. And I know you
Yeah,
have 150,000 staff. And I know that you deliver 6.3 trillion query responses every year. Your business is bound to be complicated. But one thing is true, it's a monopoly and it's illegal.
yeah.
And we're not being distracted anymore.
But I like the so if you we're obviously we read a lot of these things, but product market definition is like your opening kind of argument with the competition people, which is we're going to draw a circle around a group of people, and those are your competitors, and everything we then talk about in terms of competition law is defined by that. That's your product market definition. And Google, quite as you can understand, if you're working for Google, you'd say it's all advertising. And everybody
Mm-hmm.
in these cases always says, no, 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 it's search advertising And when we draw that circle, there's you, and there's this size, massively accepted kind of 90+% dominant position, and there's Bing, and then there's a couple of and that's right, and that's where we want to start from. And so, as you say, right at the start of it, it just says that you've tried to kind of include everything, like retail advertising and TikTok, everything that you can think of, and chuck it in and say that's just advertising. And to lose that, if you lose that point right at the top, then almost every other argument you've built on top of that is going to struggle. And I think that's what you're seeing here.
Totally. And I love that, because that takes real courage, right? Because, we're living in a very strange world at the moment where there's quite a lot of bullying going on, and there's quite a lot of, plates shifting around, politically. And so when you decide, all right, I'm going to deal with this company, and you know that this company is a poster child for the country that's being the bully, it takes a lot of courage, actually, I think, to step up. Now, you get some air cover, I guess, by the fact that the DOJ is already doing something. But you're absolutely right. It would be very easy, wouldn't it, if you're the Competition Bureau and, you think, do I really want to, pull the tail of this tiger? Do I really? I might just let it go. Maybe somebody else can do it after me. But they haven't. They haven't. And I love it. And a little bit later on, we'll get to this, but a little bit later on, in their definition and in their response, there's a just gorgeous. I love the subterfuge and the subtlety of how you land the insult. The best insult is the one you say to somebody, and then 5 hours later, they realize what you said in the cab. That's the one you want to get right. I remember Winston Churchill once said famously, there was a woman at came to Downing Street who didn't like him, and she said, if I had the chance, I'd poison your tea. And he said, if you were my wife, I'd drink it. Yeah. Now that's a little bit more pointed. I think she got that one on the moment.
Yeah.
But I just appreciate a beautiful kind of drop. And that's what they do here. Right at the very end of this, they drop in, and we'll get to this a bit later on, but they basically drop an absolute sideswipe at the White House. And they just say, hey, I know you're trying to bully us, right? I know it doesn't say this exactly, but what it says is, I know you're trying to bully us, but we're going to break them up anyway. What are you going to do about it? And I wonder what that says actually about kind of America's power in the world. Yeah, where people are just like, I think maybe this bullying's getting a bit beyond the pale. We're not really about politics. We're about the tech. So let's go through a little bit. We'll get to that. But let's go a little bit more through what's happened here. So Canada's competition argument is that Google is completely dominant in the market. Google says in its response, we're not that dominant, right? And then the Competition Commission says, well, 95% of publishers use you, and every publisher uses you. Every advertiser uses you.
Yeah.
Jazz hands didn't work. And then they say that, what you've done here, Google, is that you've constantly adapted the way you work. So there's no real one thing that's really awful, but the combination of all of the things combined on each other, eventually create a situation, Google's dominant position, practice on anti-competitive acts and effects over years warrant the remedies that we're doing here. So it's not any one thing, it's lots and lots and lots of things. And that's often the case, but that makes it even more difficult to find the smoking gun.
Yeah, and I like the two. I feel like I should write. Maybe I'll do a competition compendium of fancy terms. But the
you do that, and I'll do one with all of the colourful terms. Yeah.
The two that you'll get a lot from this document is product tying and self-preferencing. And self-preferencing always sounds like something you get told off for when you're a teenager. But the self-preferencing is when you essentially, in the sort of flow of your product, as you get choices as to what you'll do next, you essentially choose Google products, Google services. You set Google as the default. So there's automatically a flow of products from your product to your product. And there isn't a fair competition point at that chance where people get to choose something else. And product tying is almost like doubling down on that and saying, if you use this product, you also have to do this. So the most recent example has been sort of if you want to be crawled for Google search, you have to then let us use that information to build AI overviews And that's not self-preferencing. That's literally those two things are tied together. And if you
Yep.
want A, you have to give us B. And so those two principles again, they run through this document over and over again. Gradually over time, it says you've got this monopoly, and that allows you to do all these other things. And in most of the competition law case, having a monopoly in itself is not a harm. It's not what you've got; it's what you do with it.
Yeah.
And so all of this kind of flowing out of this, as you say, the ecosystem that's been built up to continually, increase the dominance is what's very neatly described in this document.
What's really interesting, by the way, when you put it like that, is that I had a company, I had a startup, a tech startup, an AI
Mm.
tech startup,
Mm.
in fact, and I had to go and raise money from investors to do that, right? And the first thing that the investors talk about is, how are you going to protect what you do? Why is your idea unique? How are you
Mm.
going to be able to defend yourself from everybody else? And in tech terms, it's known as a moat. I think you
Mm.
wrote about it, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
Did
Yeah,
you?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so it was very good, by the way. You should all go and read Chris's Substack on that. But on this moat thing, they're saying to you, okay, Ricky, well, your technology is really, really good. It's got IP, it's got a patent, okay, and as a result, it feels defensible. But somebody with big, deep pockets might come after you. So you need a moat so you can stop any army getting to your castle.
Mm.
What we're seeing here is that Google's built an incredible moat, and in 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, even right, that was the right thing to do. And now it's the wrong thing to do because now it's the moat that you're being prosecuted for. So that's
Mm.
very interesting because it's
Mm.
kind of tells you a little bit about kind of the, people talk a lot about late stage capitalism, if you like, but this is kind of late stage investing or late stage VC because every VC wants you to be a monopoly because if you're a monopoly, you write your own checks. But if you become that good at monopoly, eventually you
Mm.
become an illegal monopolist. So the job you do hasn't changed. Your behavior has not changed from Thursday to Friday. But on
No.
Thursday, you're a superhero, and on Friday, you're a supervillain.
Yeah, and that journey from being sort of a browser to the browser to the internet is the bit that, and then I mean, this is why. So a lot of this stuff, I think when we talk about technology companies and digital platforms and things, there's often this sense that this is incredibly new and we've never seen this before. I mean, we saw this in like railroads in America in the 1800s.
Yeah,
There is
telcos.
exactly that this has happened many times before. And that's why, as we sort of stress, these are 20-year-old companies coming to that point where competition specialists like to come and have a look. And what they find is, the world would be more innovative if we broke these companies up than if we allowed them to kind of keep exploiting that market position, which this does beautifully.
It does do it beautifully. And the funny thing is that when the court case first started with Google in America, I remember so many people were ringing me up saying this is never going to go anywhere. No one's going to break this up. And I was like,
Mm,
do you think that Google's a monopoly?
mm,
And
mm.
you ask any single person in the world that question, and they're like, yeah. And you go, okay. So it is a monopoly. So the prosecution is for being a monopoly and using that monopoly power
Yeah.
to benefit yourself. And they're like, yeah. And you go, do you think they do that? Like literally every person in the world that doesn't work at Google goes, mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
yet people were saying in the street, there's no way they're going to be prosecuted for it. So I
Mm.
wonder what that disconnect was. I mean, can you have any idea what the kind of societal disconnect is? Because yes, they absolutely are, and
Yeah.
no, it will never absolutely be prosecuted.
Well, there's a few things. I mean, at the start, a lot of it was about traditionally competition law is obsessed with pricing, and the main harm of having a big monopoly is you jack up prices. And
Mm.
in a lot of these sort of free to air digital services, free to the consumer digital services, there wasn't really a kind of competition model because they didn't jack up prices, and actually advertising prices didn't particularly rise because inventory kept rising. So there was almost like as a competition sort of law is a kind of economic strain, and it has a set of rules, and these didn't really fit into those rules, and so there was a
Yeah, that's
sort of
right.
that sort of held it back for a while. Then I think there was a period where it was a bit like, well, hang on a minute, and this is the most interesting thing I think about this particular kind of moment in time. Can a national competition regulator or an EU competition regulator or a non uh,
Yeah.
US effectively, let's call it that, but it's really can you be a competition prosecutor from somewhere else and impose things like breakup regulations on someone who's headquartered somewhere else? And I think a lot of people have just felt, well, we have, we're just a humble nation state. We don't have the power to kind of control multinational corporations in that way. And if you go back to the kind of maybe the biggest sort of point of hubristic joy that these companies had, there's a lot of pronouncements from sort of Mark Zuckerberg, particularly, that we're sort of nation states. Like, it's a very outdated concept. We're kind of the global kind of movers and shakers. So there was that period, and then I just think in the last few years it's just run its road, and it's become so obvious that there are these entrenched monopolies, and that it is swallowing up everything in its path. And that's when competition regulators eventually go, well, whatever happens, we've got to give it a go. And that's some of the most interesting bits in this document.
So I see two things. So the first one is a really fascinating conversation that I had with somebody from Google, when they said to me, it was after the breakup, right? So after the announcement, and they were like, what do you, I'm not their best friend, but they do really want to hear my perspective on why Google is the second largest group of subscribers to my newsletter after News Corporation.
Yeah.
So, so they clearly want to hear the narrative.
Is that why you're so soft on them, Ricky?
Oh, yeah. Well, because I'm just telling the truth, and I think they don't hear it internally. It's like a cult, yeah? And sometimes they just need to be deprogrammed, right? And so I used to specialize in doing cults when I was in the tabloids, so this is kind of in my sweet spot. And so anyway, they said to me one day, they said, what did we do wrong, right, was the question, yeah? And I said, you didn't do anything wrong. I said, you won.
No.
You literally won the game of capitalism. You took it all the way to the end. But the thing is that when you're 99-0 up with 1 second to go, right, the game's going to end. And that's kind of where you're at. Yeah. And so, you have won capitalism. Congratulations. Capitalism in 2025 is about $13.5 trillion of value sitting in you and the 4 other tech companies. And congratulations, you won. But there isn't enough money or people or economy or GDP or countries, right? There just aren't enough left, right? And so eventually you just have to say, look, you've won. The other thing that happens is, and again, it's a bit like cults, is that you kind of lose your hold on reality. And that plays its way in it plays out in different ways. If you're down the ecosystem, if you're a kind of a worker bee in the business, of which there are lots, you absolutely can imagine that you're not doing the greatest job ever for humanity, because that's all you ever hear. So, on the bus that picks you up from your house, that drives you down the highway with all your mates that are also living in your ecosystem, are telling you you're awesome, you're going to tap a keyboard all day, you're going to go home and you're going to think you've solved world poverty, right? But you haven't. What you've done is you've enabled a click to be 0.0006% more effective on Tuesday, right? So there's problems with ego at that level. But when you get up to the top, you have a different level of ego, which is that we're the kings of the universe. And normal rules and laws and regulations don't apply to us. And that kind of brings us back to the Canada thing, because clause 15 of this response, or not clause, but item 15 of the response from the Competition Commission, I'll read it to you verbatim. Google's response is replete with groundless ad hominem attacks, that means personal attacks, on the commissioner, right? Including that the commissioner's allegations are, quote, tactical, quote, concocted, quote, unprincipled, quote, inappropriate, and, quote, contrived. That just feels unwise. I think even if you felt all of those things, you don't have to write them down. Like, you can think that this person over here has terrible body odor, but if you tell them to your face, you're likely to get a punch in the face.
Yeah, I don't think the commissioner liked it.
Well, the commissioner's next line is, the tribunal should ignore Google's groundless allegations, full stop. It's just like, thanks for that, but no. So I think if they weren't sure that they were going to go tough until then, That's when they decided. I mean, I don't know when a already internationally convicted illegal monopoly thinks it's okay to go and call the commissioner of a foreign nation state's
Mm.
anti-corruption tribunal unprincipled. You know,
Doesn't doesn't seem
what's
smart, does it?
happened here?
Yeah.
No. And what do you think was in their head? I mean, do you just,
I think. I suppose if you're, you've got to try and make, I think, the point. So if I put myself in the place of if I'm working for Google's legal team, you are in a sort of existential position, right? You are in a
yeah,
battle for, so I think that means that you have to, in some ways, discredit the argument that's being made against you. I think that there are, some of the ways that they'll try to do that. We've seen, recently the studies in the EU, which is we can do it with data, which is we'll try and selectively kind of make an argument based on data that says there's no value. You can do it by trying to bring in kind of scientists. We know that there's a long history of funding studies and scientific kind of explorations of markets and things that are then brought in to support it. Or I guess you can just discredit the people that are making the decision. And particularly right now, and we see this, you can see this in with Meta as well. You try and invoke national security. You try and invoke, this is an attack on America, or this is an attack on the rights of free trade. Um, it's actually, we've probably watched this now for 10, 15, 10, 15 years, right, as it plays out. And I think you can almost see like those old rock formations where the kind of it falls on it. You can see the sort of, this is the Mesozoic era, and this is the kind of right. So if this fell on its side over 10 to 15 years, you'd be able to say, oh, all of the argument here was about access to. Here it becomes a conversation about AI. Here it's a conversation
yeah.
about
No, you're
free
right.
trade. Yeah.
Privacy, national interest. Yeah,
Free
all of that.
speech. It's all about free speech. That's what
Oh
we
my
need to do.
goodness.
And so these are just, they're sort of convenient. You kind of open the Google legal larder, and in there's a stock of arguments that you can pick, and at any given point they can be deployed. That's the job of kind of people writing the briefs in the other direction. But I
Yeah.
think that does rely on the people on the other side of the table, having more patience with those arguments than we see in this particular case.
100%. And so I used to play parks football in South London. Yeah.
Mm.
So, you have to have a fairly good sense of self-preservation to play parks football in South London. And so, generally there'd be a brutal tackle, right? And then
Yeah,
somebody would come over and just go, play the man, not the ball.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah,
That was the orders, right? So, neck high tackles are now allowed.
yeah,
When I read this, the very first thing I thought was, I'm just not sure, Google, it's a great idea to play the man, not the ball here.
yeah.
You can make an argument that you provide an incredibly useful public service that organizes the world's information. I think that's
Mm.
an incredibly strong and powerful defense that you can stand confidently behind and say,
Mm.
look what we've done for the last 25 years. Look, all right, we may have gone slightly off the rails, but hey, look, we want to come back. Give us a bit of a moment, okay, and we'll get
Mm.
there. But look, this has been a really rushed era. Everybody's
Yeah,
wanted the money. We appreciate that we need to have a reconsideration. So give us a moment and we'll fix this, okay? What you don't do is go to the one person in the country that can take you to pieces and go, I think you're concocting this and you are unprincipled. It's the wrong thing to do. It's a bit like going for a neck high tackle when the guy's 6'7" and like
yeah.
built like this. Wrong argument. And so it just looked to me like a temper tantrum or a panic from a company that's rapidly realizing it's yesterday's hero.
Not to mix our metaphors, but I also think there is a bit of the this is like international Love Island as well, where they
Go
can't.
on.
Well, they're in
I
sort
don't
of.
know where this is going.
I'll tell you where this is. So they're kind of, imagine they're moving from room to room, right? And they essentially can't admit anything in the Canada room that affects the
Oh, yeah.
case in the US room.
Okay.
right? And all of the contestants on the other side of the table talk to each other.
Yep.
So
Yep. Yep.
you've got
Okay, I
them
get.
moving, right? You've got them moving from room to room and trying to sort of desperately think about what they've said in the room they were in before, because everything's a precedent. So what they could have done in Canada is come through and said, hey, look, we know that the DOJ is going to kind of in the US is going to rule on these things. So it's pretty likely that we're going to have to divest Chrome, and it's pretty likely we're going to have to do these things. Would that kind of get us to a position where you felt that the kind of monopoly had been toned down in Canada?
Well, yeah, right. Why
Right?
would you increase the temperature?
Because what you can't do in that is you cannot go into the Canada room and admit something that you've just said in the other room you didn't do. Hence
I
the Love
appreciate
Island
that.
analogy, right? Which is, you've kind of you've just got to keep telling the same different stories in all of the and hold your story together while everybody meets up on the terrace afterwards and says, "What did they say to you? Did they say the same thing to you? Because he said to me."
Is this what happens when you tell a white lie that
Yeah,
ever
yeah,
so quickly kind of spins up to become one of
yeah,
those really bad black lies, right?
yeah.
So on that topic, actually perfect, right? So what again? I sat through all of the antitrust trials and all of the
Mm,
evidence in the states. And so I've heard all of these arguments before over there. So I've already heard the white lie version, okay?
mm,
And now I'm over here watching it again. And there's a comment uh, from Google in its defense document again, which is that we're not really a monopoly because we're more than just advertising. We do this, we do that. So there's lots of ad servers out there, so
mm.
we're not dominant. And then Canada's just like 90+% market share.
Yeah,
Okay, well, kind of shuts that down. And then it's like, well, everybody, publishers can sell their own ads if they want. And then people are like, no, you pretty much control all of the ad market as well. But
yeah,
they can use any ad server. Oh no, you're completely dominant. Or they don't have to
yeah,
use Google search. Oh no, you're
yeah.
completely dominant. And each place they go, their success has boxed them in. And so, to your point, you're absolutely right. So over here, they say something, and then they can't change it over here, right?
No.
And so once you've been caught, well, if that's absolutely right, if we take what you've just said to be completely
Mm.
right, then they're going to lose everywhere in the world, aren't they?
Well, yes, because as soon as I think in the summer, as soon as the DOJ case kind of does remedies, that becomes
Yeah.
the basis point for everybody else to kind of look at remedies on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very hard also to cry foul from a kind of protectionist, free speech, free trade, anti-American perspective when you go back to your own side and they're saying the same thing. So yeah, I think I don't know whether they're going to lose everything everywhere, but it definitely feels like gradually the precedents will build up on top of each other, and it's
Yeah.
very hard then to argue all the evidence that could be sort of brought to bear. And we all know that the regulators are thick as thieves, right? They are absolutely in contact with each other. They know
Oh yeah.
exactly when all these things are going to be coming out, and they're very careful to construct these cases kind of in
Yeah.
lockstep. So,
Which, for everybody that doesn't know, I speak to them a lot. They say
mm,
this is almost unique.
mm,
That international competition authorities work with this much.
yeah,
What's the word I'm looking for here? In such partnership, and they're
yeah,
sharing very openly. There's quite a lot of competition historically between competition
yes,
authorities, which is kind of ironic. But this time they're all just like it's open book. We've got to
mm,
fix this. We've got to fix this. And I think that's quite stark. I was in Canada not very long ago, and the very first thing they said was, "What the competition commission there were just like, do you know Rod Sims in Australia? Like, because he's a superhero." And I'm like,
yeah,
"Wow, I'm as far away as you can get, pretty much in the world."
yeah,
And they're asking me about a superhero in the competition commission over here.
yeah.
I find that really interesting.
So what's also interesting is so let's come back to this kind of actually before we do just so in terms of this particular document's dropped. What does it
Mm.
just can you just summarize to people what does this mean right now?
What it means is that America has said that Google's going to be broken up, and the breakup has many, 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 many different angles. Okay, but what Canada's saying is that we're going to break Google up in our country as well, and even if you don't, right?
Yeah,
So the DOJ has been very, very clear in America, the Department of Justice. So the Department of Justice brings the case against Google, prosecutes them in court. It wins. Google loses. The DOJ says we want all of this breakup to happen. Then everything goes quiet because we have a new president. And is he going to do the same thing? A new DOJ comes in and they say, we're still going to break them up. So Google's still broadly in the same problem. This is Canada saying, do you know what? We're going to break them up no matter what happens. Under our laws and our permissions.
So just to be clear, so what Canada's saying is, and I'm slightly being pedantic, but it's what Canada's saying is you can't operate in Canada as a single entity. So we can't as Canada, we can't break Google up back in the US, right? That your decision what you do in the US, that's not our jurisdiction. We have no authority
Correct.
in the US. But what we can say is if you want to operate in Canada with a license to be a Canadian business, you cannot own all these different parts of the jigsaw. And so you are going to have to operate in Canada. Either you're going to have to, so there's lots of ways you could do that. You could essentially, so just take an example. The DOJ can say you have to sell Chrome because you're a US business and we're the US, competition people. Canada can say... They
have said that, yeah.
Yeah, Canada can say you cannot operate Chrome in the Canadian market. Now, what you do in your own backyard is none of our business, but you cannot do that here. And that's, so this is really interesting because it's the same for the UK. The UK we know is going to have kind of views on how it treats digital regulation. And the EU is going to have rules on how it's going to treat digital regulation. And there's sort of a sense at the moment of this toing and fro, which is, is that going to be something that's traded away? Or are people going to say, no, in this jurisdiction, we set competition law. And that's pretty entrenched, the view that you set the competition laws for your markets. So that's why I think this is so interesting, because as you say, it's very clear. And there's a couple of paragraphs where they could not be any clearer that Canada has jurisdiction over Canada. And
yeah. So last week when we had a chat, we dropped in the now buzzword, that there's going to be a splinternet. So Google's complete domination of the internet has meant that every country effectively has a homogenous version of Google. And that's kind of been okay because there's been a trade that says that Google's going to help you find your content. Google will help you monetize it. Google's going to ride that all the way to a, $350 billion worth of revenue and a $2 trillion market cap. But that trade's okay. We're good with that. Yeah. And Google should have just ridden that train and just stayed on that train, but it didn't. It wanted to keep going. It wanted to keep showing 15, 20% year-on-year growth. And the only way it could do that was like a plague of locusts, is just to eat this field, but then eat that field, and then eat that field. And there's no food left. And eventually the people rebel. And that's kind of what's happened. And so what we talked about last week was the concept that there's going to be a kind of splinter net where we're going to have national internets that are going to have national laws. Now, this is pertinent because on several of the calls that you and I have had over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about copyright. Copyright is a global concept, pretty much agreed to by most countries in the world, until America passed a doctrine that changed it, that said we're going to have fair use, which gave more freedom to people to use content. But that's an American law that has no jurisdiction anywhere else. Are you drinking scotch?
Yep. Coffee, unfortunately.
That has no it's out of shot. So I wasn't sure if you were having a sneaky one. So they're taking laws out of jurisdiction to other countries and just going, oh, you're going to have to follow our law there. No, you don't. Right. And I've had lots and lots of conversations with the competition authorities and the copyright agencies around the world going, why are you saying yes? You don't have to say yes. You've got your own law. You don't have the death penalty here. So why are you saying yes? What other American laws do you want, right? Maybe we'll have gun ownership, right? But no one would do it for that. But people have kind of got used to America having this permission to pass its laws on to other people. It's like a boiling frog, right? It happens little bit by little bit and you don't really notice. Canada's just called BS on that in this document. Canada's literally just said, we have a free trade agreement with you. This was the thing that I love most in this document. So if there's one thing to take away from all of this, and I love all the rest of it, but I love this the most, is that there's a free trade agreement between Canada, America, and Mexico. Okay? And you know this. And the free
Mm.
trade agreement basically says something like, if it's the same as all the other free trade agreements I've read, it says something like, you're not going to do anything to impact on American companies working in your jurisdiction. And as a result, we're going to buy all of your beef, or we're going to take
Yeah.
all of your wood, or whatever it might be. And this whole setup says really simply that you're going to have to do what we say, because it says so in this free trade agreement. Because if you want to trade with America, the world's largest economy, then you have to stick to these rules. And if you don't, then we're going to do something nasty to you. Like we'll say we're not taking your red wine anymore, or whatever it might be.
Yep.
Which is effectively a tariff by another name. Yeah.
Yep.
And we've seen these over the years, right? The UK's had these, Europe's had these,
Yep.
there's lots of these, right? And so this is kind of a warning. Like, don't fuck with us, or otherwise we'll just like hurt you economically. But what's happened here in Canada is that the White House has already issued the punishment, because it's already issued the tariff, right? And so they've said, oh, we're going to put a tariff on all of your imported goods from Canada. You've got Donald Trump making fun of the Prime Minister of Canada, saying, you're my 51st state and I'll do whatever I want there. And so if you like, the danger of sticking up your middle finger to them has already happened. So there's like no penalty anymore for saying, well, why don't you just go fuck yourself then, right?
Yeah.
And so beautifully in here, they say, right, Canada has its own laws and its own rules, and it will follow its own rules and laws. Thank you. Like, it's just like, go on then. What are you going to do that's worse than what you've already done? And so what we're seeing, what I think we're seeing here, is the seeds of the splinter net starting to happen. Google, if you want to come play in Toronto, mate, okay, this is the way it's going to be, because we've decided this is how you get to play in our backyard, buddy.
Yeah.
And if you don't like it, guess what? We'll find another one. It's okay.
Yeah.
We're cool with that. That's what this says. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. And it's the same in the UK, and it's the same everywhere else.
And interestingly, so there's a few other bits knocking around at the moment. Obviously, we'll talk about the tariffs in a sec, but if you think about the TikTok case is essentially America saying, if you want to operate in our jurisdiction, you can't operate like this. So it's exactly the same argument.
Totally.
Exactly the same argument. Made
And
in
sorry,
a different setting.
just before you carry on, just want to also remind everybody that the American government turned off TikTok in 4 hours. Yeah. So everybody says, oh, that can't possibly happen. Oh, no, they did. Just like that. Somebody went and pulled a plug out somewhere, right? And so Canada can do the same thing to Google. Sorry to interrupt.
But that's exactly the point. And the argument that's made is, you want to operate in this jurisdiction, you operate by these rules. And, that argument is something we're going to be hearing, I think, a lot more. For the tariff lovers on the call, it's worth just saying, everything you've heard of in the last few days is about tariffs on goods. Everything we're talking about in terms of digital advertising revenue is counted as services. So at this point, all of the repatriated revenue that's come from Amazon, from Google, from Apple, from all of that, Meta, it isn't anywhere in the discussion about the tariffs that we've just heard about. But if you're the EU, for example, you've just received this 20% tariff on goods because you've got a goods trade surplus, but you actually have a services deficit. And part of the reason you have a services deficit is because all of this money is flowing back in digital advertising revenue, which counts as US services. It is inconceivable that these things are not now considered to be part of the same debate. And so, I think you're absolutely right. I think what's happened over the last few days, in terms of the sort of probably slightly the erosion of goodwill, the erosion of public sentiment, which allows kind of people like the commissioner here to kind of take a stronger stand, has definitely changed. And I think the fact that the US has, for its own reasons, which we won't get into now, but for its own reasons, sort of put a hand grenade into trade generally, that changes the whole of the backdrop under which these conversations are being had, because you've got one of the great powers saying, I am going to put our national interest first, and you are going to have to live with that decision. And so every other nation state is likely to say, okay, then, well, we then have to put our interests first. Um, you know, that's kind of what happens, and we'll find a way in the middle. So it definitely has. I think there's nobody making the argument that Canada should just do what China wants to do with the internet, right? And if anybody did make that argument, it would be laughed out of the room. And I think we're going to see the beginnings of a lot of these decisions, which are based on the idea that positioning is just over for the US, I think.
Right. So this is going to be what we end. This is going to be the story of the next 12 months, I think, or the rest of this presidency, right? Because I don't know what happens after it. But it's very clear that America has some very serious economic problems. It doesn't have enough money. Its GDP is the same as its debt. If it was my household budget, yeah, I'd be moving to a farm in the country or trying to find another job, right? And so, there are serious problems in the US economy, which is why it's taking this protectionist approach, right? And this happens all the time when various empires fall, and that just is what it is. China, somebody said to me, I was listening to something on The Economist the other day, and somebody said something like, what's China's best strategy? And their response was, well, just wait it out. It's like,
well, what's the old?
They don't have to do anything.
No, what's the old Napoleon line? Never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake.
That's right. Just let it play out, right? And that's kind of how I feel.
Sorry, you should tell everyone about your letter. The letter you were saying was going around from China to Australia.
So we've got a situation where the Chinese government is directly approaching Australian businesses and saying, sorry, all this is happening to you. But look, we're here. We're stable. We're a growing economy. We'd love more of your trade. Come and chat to us. Yeah, come and, because Australia is a really fascinating place. I know it's very, very far away and we're famous for beaches and sharks and spiders, but there's a little bit more to it than that. Geopolitically, we're a fascinating country because, as an Englishman and an expat that lives here, all of Australia in all of the 25 years I've lived here has always looked to America. All our television is America. We have a dollar. It's very much American centric. UK is not really talked about much here, even though it's a part of the United Kingdom or the Commonwealth. But very much it's American. I was really surprised by that when I came. But it's also the banking hub for the whole of Asia, which includes China. So there's incredible wealth here because the funnel of wealth around the world into China comes through here, through our banks. And so, when a house, when a $15 million house comes up to be bought here, it's not bought by an American. Yeah, it's somebody on the phone to someone in the garden that's going to go, yeah, I'll take it. Oh, by the way, I need to demolish that and do this. And it's big money coming in from China. So Australia is very exposed to Chinese growth, economic growth, and Indian growth, because that's just down the road as well from here, right? So, admittedly, it's 12 hours, but, it's not far away. Yeah. I mean, in the UK, you've got Greece. Congratulations. But in America, right, you've got nothing. Yeah, you've got Milwaukee. Yeah. So it's kind of tricky for America to compete. So there is clearly a changing of power, financial power and clout from the west to the east. And Australia kind of finds itself in the middle of that melting pot.
Do you know, you just reminded me, many years ago, like last century, I worked in Sydney for a bit and I worked in the Amex building. It's 26 floors.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's true. Every single floor, 26 floors, and every single one was a different country operation. So I worked in the Australian operation. But when you get in the lift in the morning, it was essentially like an Asia Pac melting pot. And as you go up, they'd the Thailand team would disappear, then the Malaysian team, then the Singapore team. And I was the same. I hadn't realised as a Brit, how integrated those economies were. I can imagine. I was thinking yesterday about going up in that lift. Just the chat in that lift yesterday morning was like, "How did you do? 40%. How did you do? 54%."
Yeah, I know. So there's a lot of growth, but just coming back to something you talked about earlier on, this whole argument about digital services taxes. So again, this sounds really, really dull, but it actually impacts on all of us now. So the logic is this: it's really simple. if you bring your company Google to my country, Australia,
Mm.
where I live, and you decide you want to operate here, and you generate $10 billion in advertising revenue, which is what they refuse to admit they earn, but the
Yep.
Competition Commission here identified they earn, and then they say, okay, well, you earn $10 billion, you now have to pay 30% tax because that's the corporate tax rate here in Australia,
Mm.
and Google goes, well, that's not going to happen. So all of this money that we've earned wasn't actually earned here because the technology that earned it was on a technology platform that sits way, 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 way over here in America. And so we're going to
Mm.
pay our tax in America, but they don't pay their tax in America. What they do is they take the money down a pipe, it goes to Ireland, it's
Mm.
washed in Ireland, and then they report their tax. And so I've made it a bit of a kind of passion point that every time they report their numbers, I go and dig out their real
Mm.
taxation number. So I can tell you that Google's, Apple's was 11.6%, and Meta's was 11.75%, and Google's was 11.7%. Okay,
Mm.
and it's been as low as 6%.
Mm.
Now, if you're a country and you're watching $10 billion of your GDP, your gross domestic product, the wealth of your nation leaving down an internet pipe to go to a
Yeah.
low tax jurisdiction and back to America to sit in a coffers down in Google, who we know is a twice convicted illegal monopolist, right? You start to think that maybe this isn't a terrific outcome for your nation. And if you're a politician, you probably think that eventually that's going to come back and hurt you, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
what you do is you say, I'm going to have a digital service tax. I'm going to charge you a taxation level based on what you earn here, not based
Yep.
on what you can try and manipulate or finagle or whatever word you
Mm.
want to use to say that you earn less. That, again, is putting all of these American tech companies under pressure, which means all these free trade agreements that have protected these tech companies for the last 20 years on this, because of the tariffs, just evaporates. And
Yeah.
governments suddenly discover they have confidence because there's no penalty for being tougher. So I think it's actually going to work the opposite way to the way it's intended.
Yeah, I think it's 2%, isn't it? The digital service tax in
Yeah,
so I think the UK
but two
charges 2%.
2% of earnings though, not of
Yeah.
profits,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's the critical piece.
Yeah. So by which by all accounts is on the table in the trade discussions. So it's interesting just in terms of our sort of where we are right now is this sudden kind of, for years, if you like, trade and competition law have been relatively separate.
Yeah,
And they've kind of operated in different sort of at different levels with different people. Suddenly, this is all now kind of the same. It's coming to the desks of national leaders, and they're going to have to sort of think about both those things together. Um, it's interesting. So this morning, I think the EU's fined Amazon 754 million euros
hang on a
for.
minute, hang on a minute, just hang on, hang on. There you go. It's no problem.
but interesting that. So I thought it was interesting. It's an interesting move because it's obviously, the EU has officially not responded yet to any tariffs, but they also haven't put their foot on that in terms of that coming through. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting few weeks, I think, as we kind of get a sense of the responses
Yeah.
and whether and how digital regulation and competition law is sort of affected by conversations about tariffs.
I think that smart people, I think governments contain many, many smart people. And I can tell you without any doubt whatsoever, because I know there are many,
Mm.
many, many smart people working in the regulators. And for years and years and years, these people have had their hands tied by political decisions that are outside their control. And
Mm.
they haven't been able to bring into play the limitations that are required. The guardrails that should have been in place
Mm.
just haven't been there for various reasons. Globalization being a major one of them, America's power being another, the strength of the dollar being another. Yeah.
Mm.
But now these people aren't restricted by that anymore, and they're having their opportunity to do the job that they would normally have done 5 or 6 years ago. They're having to do it at a rush rate right now. And
Yeah.
I think that, if tech, and you know, and you and I know,
Mm.
both know, that, the right time to have regulated technology was probably 7 or 8, maybe even 10 years ago. That was the
Yeah.
right time to kind of cut their legs off. That's when that was the scale that the railroads were at when they were stopped. That was where the telcos were at when they were stopped. But for all of these reasons I've just described, the tech companies were allowed to run for another, half mile. And then
Yeah.
it makes it so much more difficult to stop them, but it also makes it so much more disruptive for global markets when you do. And
Yeah.
so I think what we're learning, what I hope we're learning in this process, is that the laws exist for a reason. And when you know you've reached that point, the law has to act. And politics and convenience can't trump the law.
Yeah.
That's not meant to be a pun. It
Nice
is
choice. Yeah.
not
Yeah.
meant.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not meant to override the law. The law exists to be a check and a balance. It's not a convenience.
Yeah.
It's an actual barrier.
Yeah.
And so I think there's been a failure of courage amongst the regulators, and there's been a failure of action by the courts that's allowed this to get to a point where it's created a near global financial crisis. And the open web might be the victim. Yeah,
Yeah.
it might
Yeah.
end because of this.
Yeah.
That's a shame, but it doesn't mean that we don't build a better one next.
Can we have let's have a bit of fun. I reckon
Why was that not fun? I thought that
that
was
was fun.
hilarious.
Yeah,
Personally,
yeah.
yeah.
One of the one of the things we know that April 5th was the date where the TikTok decision's coming round in the States. So Donald Trump gave kind of a stay of execution and said, "Well, we'll do a deal." Which is fairly familiar kind of territory for him. We'll try and do a deal, but it's got to be done by April 5th. And the Supreme Court has said it can't operate in the US, and the solution that they came up with was to find a buyer. So one of the things I thought of yesterday was my bet, and I'll take a bet with you, right? If
We're going to
I'll
buy
take a
it.
bet with you. You and I are going to put the money in.
Oh,
My bet
oh.
is that right now I cannot see a world in which the Chinese government approves a forced sale of TikTok to hand it over to American control, where one of the requirements would be that it effectively got the secret source of the TikTok algorithm and all the AI that sits behind it, in a climate in which it has just been told it's going to take a 40% tariff on all exports from China to the US. I just cannot see that that's going to be the case. So if that's true, which is why this is fun to kind of predict this in advance, if that's true, then the Supreme Court ruling kicks back into gear because no deal's been done.
Yeah.
Now there's rumors that Amazon made a bid last week, but that would be Amazon effectively saying, "Well, give us 50%, 50% plus share of this and access to the TikTok AI." Chinese government says no to all those deals, doesn't allow it to go through. Donald Trump has to then effectively shut down TikTok in the US as a direct result of all of the conversations that we've just been talking about.
170 million people lose their TikTok, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I just think that's such an interesting. If you're sat in Beijing now, why would you allow some of your IP to go? Why would you feel favourable to that deal? So that's my prediction for the week, and we'll find out next week if it's turned out to be different. We'll just edit this out, and I never said it.
Easy peasy, because it's not live. It's not live. Hard luck. Welcome to live TV.
Yeah.
So look, that's a really, really interesting thing. But if you view it again from a helicopter view, it's just another step towards the splinter net, because the people that want to use TikTok get to use it in the countries that allow TikTok.
Yeah.
And if America's 170 people don't get to use TikTok, they're going to be bereft. But if you lived in the UK, you can get it. It's a bit like BBC iPlayer. I'm still outraged I can't get BBC iPlayer in Australia.
But you think of it like a chessboard. You're talking about TikTok. TikTok's American revenue is about 10 billion. Let's say it does that at 60-70% margin to be generous. So it's 6 or 7 billion. In the general chessboard of the whole of the kind of Chinese American trade relationship, it's not even a pawn. And
Totally close.
so yeah, I'd be really interested to see how that plays out, and that's got to play out. I say April 5th, so I think that's Saturday over the weekend.
Yeah. There are some egos that are quite large sitting in the middle of all of this. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, you've got a Chinese ruler that's in for life, right? So he's feeling pretty confident, I would imagine. You've got an American president that's in theoretically for 4 years, but could easily
mm,
try and stay for
mm,
longer. They all, to use your chess analogy,
mm.
all of the pieces on this board is being redrawn.
Yep.
Yeah. I think we're going to end up with a splinter net. I think we are. I think we're going to have a situation where every single global media company, or sorry, global online company, is
Yeah.
going to need to adhere to national laws to be allowed to operate within that jurisdiction.
Yeah. Which seems surprising to us because we've had this period of 20 years of homogenous, sort of ubiquitous service. But actually, it's exactly the same as happens in food. It's exactly the same as happens in financial services. It's exactly the same as happens in pharmaceuticals. Every single regulated industry on earth has national standards that it sets and then regulates. It's the same in telecommunications. It's the same in broadcast communications in jurisdictions. There's a reason that the American Fox News CNN is different from the BBC because of national regulation. So
Yeah,
this is
I
not
get
like a
it.
new thing. This is just an industry catching up with the way that eventually regulated industries work. So you are right, and the reason that I think we think that a sort of a splinter net is surprising is because the promise of the World Wide Web was exactly what was written on the tin, and
Yeah.
it turns out that maybe it just can't be like that, because if the whole world is now operating on a digital platform, it falls back to nation state competition laws and regulated industries and all the stuff that protects consumers around the world. It just has to be that way.
All right. So I was typing just then because I want to let's just roll that back to what that actually means.
Mm,
So for me, and this is a very personal thing, it's just the way I see the world, right? Having run global newspaper, oh, you have as well,
mm,
right? Having
mm,
run global newspapers, my perspective on running a global newspaper was that I was the caretaker for an enormously important brand that had existed for a century before me. And it was far bigger than me. But I got to have a conversation. My imprint, even imperceptibly, was on
mm,
a conversation with half of the population. Yeah.
mm,
And I felt the weight of that responsibility very much. Okay. So if I got it wrong, I would pay heavily. But the biggest penalty of all for me would be that I got it wrong for half the nation. I really
yeah,
felt that, honestly. I'm not
yeah,
just saying that. That's actually how I felt. And it's what tortured me most about the job was the weight of that responsibility on my shoulders. In a situation, I was chatting about this yesterday on stage down in Melbourne. You know, Alexander the Great, at his absolute pomp, at the top of his power, reached 1/50th of the people that Mark Zuckerberg speaks to every day,
yeah.
right? 1/50th, and he ran half the world, right?
Mm,
But the world has moved in incredible ways, okay? And that personal liability, that personal responsibility, that personal imprint seems to have been homogenized, all
mm,
right? And so where we are now is that the World Wide Web, which was this incredible opportunity to democratize information, it was an opportunity to give everybody in the world an opportunity. It was an opportunity for a kid with a laptop in sub-Saharan Africa to be able to learn string theory if he chose to.
mm,
That gave an opportunity for humanity to take a giant leap, okay? And that's exactly how I felt about the internet when it started. And that whole mission has been horribly contorted and perverted into something that's entirely different. And I think it's such a massive shame. And if you
mm.
want to know why, it's because I can tell you exactly what the internet's worth. So if you go over here on my computer where I've been tapping away
Yeah.
on ChatGPT, all right,
Mm,
just so you
mm,
know, I've just typed in what is $13.7 trillion, okay, per minute, yeah, which is the value of
mm,
all of the tech companies.
mm.
How much does that add up to? Can you do the maths in your head? So I can
No.
help you. It's $26 million a minute.
Yeah.
So are we supposed to be surprised that corporate driven individuals and companies and shareholders have decided to break the web for profit? We probably just have to say, no, we kind of created this situation ourselves. But what we've ended up with is a broken web, which is now going to become a nationalized web, which is the entire antithesis of what we had. So we've had 25 years going all the way around the sun.
Yep.
Back to the past. Have I got that right?
Yep. Similar. I mean, it's a very similar argument. If you took the argument that the White House has made about globalization, you get the same answer. That it's been an experiment, and it's resulted in distortion, and so it needs to be corrected. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with some of the arguments, but that's the argument that's being made. So we are, as ever, we kind of get to the end of the hour. We say, look, we're living in amazing times. And
aren't we one species though, with one need?
Yeah, well, yeah, but then there's a reason that we don't eat, chlorinated chicken. There's a reason that, there's a reason that you can't borrow money in certain ways in certain jurisdictions, right? There are, yes, we are one people, theoretically a species, but nations exist. I mean, we're so far into this, that is just the reality. And so it turns out that if the entire world is digitized, then it will break down into digitized nation states. That's where I think it will ultimately end.
Well, my take, for what it's worth, is that if you have wealth as the ultimate goal, eventually greed wins. And greed only benefits one or two or three or four, in this case, 5 people. And, 4 billion people lose out, which I think is a real shame. Oh, drives me mad. Look, anyway, the good news is that Google's going to be fucked over in Canada, and I'm very happy about that. And then let's start there, and we'll build baby steps towards a better future. All right?
Brilliant.
So no one's asked us a question today. I think they were all like, whoa, I'm not messing with these guys. They sound like they're furious. But look, thanks so much, everybody, for joining in. We'll be back again, same time next week, to talk about, I don't know, what should we do next week? Should we do nuclear proliferation?
7 days is a long time. 7 days is a long time at the moment, Ricky. We'll pick it on Wednesday, Thursday.
We'll see what's happening. Mate, you're a legend. Thank you so much.
See ya.
I'll catch you later. Cheers, buddy. Take it easy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.